everyone. Incredible honour to be here. If you're surprised to see a failed Logie nominee talking about human rights, imagine how I feel. The Victorian Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities Act is unique amongst Australian states. Passed in 2006, it speaks proudly to Victoria's tradition as a progressive state, one that values human rights sufficiently to enshrine them in law. And two of these rights are central to my talk this morning. One, the right to freedom of thought, conscience, religion and belief. And two, the right to protection from torture and cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment. These rights lie at the heart of a voluntary assisted dying legislation which will be debated in your Parliament in September. As I explain why, I want you to keep one thing firmly in mind. We fight to live. It is our very deepest urge. A law to help someone die is written for a very particular, a very small group of people. They are the very sickest people in our society, the most vulnerable, and there is only one reason why any of them would seek such help or be given it. Because sometimes, despite the best medical care, the only thing that will end suffering is death. But first, the good news. Although 85% of us will die of a chronic illness, the vast majority of us will die well. We know this because just over 2 years ago, a small cog in the vast machinery of this state's democracy began to turn. And for a small cog, it had a big title: Parliament of Victoria Legislative Council Legal and Social Issues Committee Inquiry into End-of-Life Choices. Catchy. 8 upper house parliamentarians, 3 Labor, 2 Liberal, 1 Green, 1 Sex Party, under the chairmanship of Liberal MLC Ed O'Donoghue, spent 10 months going around the state listening to, consulting with patients, doctors, nurses, palliative care physicians, carers, medical specialists, ethicists, priests, lawyers and ordinary Victorians to find out how well we conduct end-of-life care in this state. And the answer is, by and large, very well. When you pick your way through some of the 1,037 submissions and read the transcripts from the 17 days of public hearings held around the state, one thing becomes clear. Though they could use more resources, something the government has pledged to do, our palliative care system mostly does a tremendous job in achieving their stated goal, which is to alleviate the pain and suffering of Victorians who are dying. The skill with which they treat the complex mixture of physical, emotional and psychological symptoms that come into play as people die is borne out every week in death notices, where families go out of their way to thank the medical staff for their tender and diligent care. But if the excellence of palliative care was one of the themes that came out of the inquiry, the committee also found something lacking in our end-of-life care, something causing so much harm that they concluded maintaining the status quo is an inadequate, head-in-the-sand approach to the plight of the Victorians discussed in this report. What is that plight? Here's what 10 months of inquiries found is happening in our community. Repeated examples of inadequate pain relief being delivered to dying patients by doctors for fear of breaking the law. The inability of palliative care, despite its many benefits, to relieve all suffering. People being put on trial for helping those they love find a merciful end. Doctors being forced to break the law in order to help their patients die, but having to do so without support, regulation or accountability. Trauma experienced by families watching seriously ill loved ones refuse food and water to expedite death and finally relieve their suffering. And people experiencing an irreversible deterioration in health, taking their own lives, often in horrific circumstances. And faced with this undeniable evidence, and by a clear majority of 6-2, the committee recommended a law that would allow people to seek assistance to die. In their words, this would not only enable patients' end-of-life wishes to be respected, but also to protect patients, particularly vulnerable people, from abuse and coercion. Now, to understand why we need a new law, you first need to understand what options Victoria's current laws offer to someone who is dying and suffering beyond medical relief. And essentially there are 3. Today in Victoria, if you're dying and suffering beyond medical relief, it is legal to end your life by committing suicide. Guns, ropes, poison, worse, the choice of deliverance is yours. Today in Victoria, if you are dying and suffering beyond medical relief, it is legal to end your life by refusing all medical treatment, food and water, and to die slowly by starvation and dehydration in combination with the effects of your disease. Today in Victoria, if you are dying and suffering beyond medical relief, it is legal for a doctor to slowly put you into a coma, even without your consent, leaving you to die over days or sometimes weeks, It's called terminal sedation, or alternatively, pharmacological oblivion. What is not legal in Victoria, if you are dying and suffering beyond medical relief, is to end your life painlessly and quickly at a time of your choosing with the help of a doctor. Let's start with legal option number 1, taking your own life. And I apologise, some of what you're about to hear is distressing, but it's real. Of the many testimonies given in evidence to the committee, none was more powerful than that of the Victorian coroner, John Olley. He detailed the horrific ways in which desperately ill Victorians are taking their own lives to end their suffering. In giving evidence, Coroner Olley wanted to bring to light a very particular group of people, older Victorians with no history of mental illness and from loving family relationships who, in his words, were taking their own lives in desperate and violent ways. According to the coroner, what these people had in common was that each was suffering an irreversible decline, either from a terminal disease or multiple chronic illnesses or permanent physical pain. The stories John Olley related were deeply distressing, so much so that he, the coroner, had to collect himself 3 times while giving his own evidence. They included a 90-year-old man with prostate cancer who shot himself with a nail gun, and an 82-year-old chronically ill woman who bled to death in a lounge room after slashing her wrist with a knife and scissors. He said that his office saw no way of preventing these deaths, nor, in his estimation, were they people likely to qualify for palliative care. And he went on to say, what seems to be a common thread through the family is this absolute sense of respect for someone they love and this absolute sense of helplessness. They know this person is screaming for help, but no one is going to answer the call, not in this society, so they have to die alone. He estimated the number of elderly Victorians dying in this way at 1 a week. Legal option number 2, if we're dying and suffering beyond medical relief, voluntary refusal of food and fluids. Under the Victorian Medical Treatment Act, a competent adult who is dying has a legal right to refuse to eat and drink and cannot be force-fed. Such refusal is not considered suicide. This is a recognition of the principle that everyone deserves respect to make their own decision, that a treatment is too burdensome. And most often, to support this choice, a dying patient will move into palliative care where they will seek maximum relief from pain and suffering. They don't always get it, and more of that later, but even if they do, it's a slow process. As Professor Richard Chai, the head of palliative care at St Vincent's Sacred Heart, Sydney, told me, it can take, quote, weeks which are psychologically painful for both the person dying and their family watching on. He even volunteered that he'd had one patient who was so distressed at how long it was taking to die this way that she committed suicide within palliative care, the very people she had turned to ease her dying. Why would any patient choose such a slow and painful way to die? Because it's quicker and less painful than letting the disease take its course. It's one of the few options that our law allows, and it's almost the only instance where a dying patient has the legal right to assert themselves over their doctor. The human cost of ending your life this way was spelt out to the inquiry by Anne Woodger. Her father was in his 60s and dying of motor neurone disease, an incurable and brutal illness known colloquially as the bastard. And these are Anne's words. While they all respected his right to decide to end his life, it gave him no help to do it and insisted that he must die slowly of starvation and dehydration. His final morning at home was heartbreaking. My mother dressed him and he thanked her, using his e-tram board to dictate his message for their happy marriage and for caring for him. He then asked to see for the last time the garden that he'd planted. He sat for a long time in his wheelchair on the front veranda with my mum and just looked at the garden until a disabled taxi arrived and he left his home forever. And while the staff of the hospice were kind and considerate, there was no escaping the necessary steps of dying this way. Mucus solidified in the back of his throat and needed to be regularly prized out with cotton buds, causing him to gag. His mouth was dry and could only be swabbed with water. Nurses, unfamiliar with his routines, tried to turn and bathe him and struggled to get him comfortable. He was eventually sedated when muscle cramps were so overwhelming and painful for him. I hope the sedation was effective in managing that pain. He died after 12 days. I cannot help thinking how much better my father's death could have been. A thoughtful and respectful decision-making process allowed him to choose to die. Sadly, he was not then offered a humane option to implement his decision, such as lethal injection or medication. Such an option would have spared him the physical distress of dying over 12 days of lack of food and water, his only choice under current law. It would also have spared him the grief of saying goodbye and leaving his home, garden and neighbourhood to die slowly in a hospital a few kilometres away with strangers tending him and his family watching his slow demise. Legal option number 3. If you're dying and suffering beyond medical relief, terminal sedation. In essence, this means that when faced with unmanageable pain and suffering, the doctor decides that the patient is to be slowly placed into a coma, sometimes because the patient is too far gone without their consent, and kept there medically supported till they die. Ray Godbold, a palliative care nurse from Inverloch, who himself died of cancer and whose children appeared before the committee, described it to me like this. I've been there when lots of people have had terrible deaths that no matter what palliative care people say, the last 24 to 48 hours of somebody's life can be completely unexpected. And the only options you've got is to make that person unconscious. And then you've got the family sitting there looking at this person who's been in terrible suffering, is now unconscious, and it's going to take hours or days or weeks to die. That's not acceptable, I don't think. In Victoria, according to the inquiry, terminal sedation is widely accepted as an appropriate way to relieve suffering for someone at the end of life. But as Australia's most senior palliative care physician, Professor Ian Maddox, explains, terminal sedation is not always effective at relieving suffering. He says, in reality, there are occasions where patients in terminal palliation do not receive adequate relief for their pain and suffering. In these cases, patients can frequently experience distressing respiratory problems. They may regain consciousness, intolerable pain may not be relieved, and they may experience a prolonged, uncertain, albeit inevitable death. The inquiry received many searing testimonies about loved ones dying slowly and suffering within our healthcare system. Fully 1/3 of the 1,000 or so individual submissions disclosed an experience of someone close to them dying or suffering from a serious illness. Why do they have it? Well, there are two main reasons. First, because assisting a suicide is punishable in Victoria by up to 5 years in jail. Our laws do not protect a doctor who intentionally assists someone to die. This makes doctors cautious about being seen to have hastened a patient's death. The only defence they have is something called the doctrine of double effect, a way of thinking that goes back to the 13th century and the Catholic philosopher Thomas Aquinas. And what it means is that if you're attending to someone who is dying, you can give them medication which may have the unintended effect of helping them to die more quickly, but only if your actual intention is to ease suffering. What you must not do, ever, because only God giveth and God taketh away the hours, is give them medication with the intention of helping them die, even if only death will end their suffering, and even if the patient is persistently asking for such relief. And today that idea is boiled down into the central tenet of palliative care. We will neither prolong nor hasten death. The doctor defends his or her actions by simply saying that they were trying to control a patient's pain. Death, they argue, was an unplanned consequence of either the patient's disease or the necessary treatment for pain. Now, the drug they use is morphine. It's an opiate. The problem is it can take days for the levels of morphine to become high enough to cause death. It's important for the doctor's safety that the process is slow. Worse, many people who've been treated for a disease such as cancer have built up a tolerance to morphine, making them even harder to sedate. The second reason why people who ask help to die quickly are left to die slowly instead is succinctly summed up by Nurse Ray Godbold. He said, the doctors, a lot of them have got religious beliefs, and that comes into the clinical area at times. I've seen it. The Catholic Church, which is, according to Cardinal George Pell, supplies nearly 60% of Australia's palliative care, is deeply opposed to any form of assisted dying. Their core belief is in the sanctity of life. And for many, the example of Christ's suffering on the cross is extremely powerful, as evidenced by Pope Benedict's statement that there is, quote, virtue in suffering. The idea of salvation through suffering is perhaps best captured by Dr. Douglas Bridge, formerly head of palliative care at Royal Perth Hospital. In March this year, Dr. Bridge wrote a passionate article in the Medical Journal of Australia attacking Victoria's proposed assisted dying legislation on the grounds that it's not a doctor assisting someone to die, it's a doctor killing someone or assisting them to commit suicide. In an online profile for the Uniting Church, Dr. Bridge explained his personal philosophy of care, one inspired by, quote, his supreme Christian calling to be a missionary. Much about his work, Doug says, is to do with healing a patient so they are ready to die. Indeed, he says, it is possible to die healed. Doctors are trained to cure diseases, and I'm trying to say, what about healing people? Not that we shouldn't cure diseases, but as well as curing disease, it would be really good if we could heal people. Reading this, there's only one possible interpretation of the expression healing people before they die. They're clearly not going to be saved from dying, so healing can only refer to spiritual cleansing. Dr. Bridge goes on to explain how this healing can happen. It's interesting that people facing death grow spiritually, Doug said, to the point where they say, it's been such a good journey. I've learned so much. The cancer has been so good to me. As Doug says, within one's suffering is an opportunity for growth. Whether all his patients feel this way, Dr. Bridge doesn't say. Professor Alex Broom of the University of New South Wales spent 6 months embedded at a Catholic hospice, observing what happens at the end of life. He saw firsthand what the personal beliefs of a medical team can mean for dying patients. He says, the idea of an afterlife and the dying process as essentially a rite of passage is very powerful. What occurs then is that you get a very idiosyncratic, values-driven form of dying. So it all comes down to what the collective around you thinks is appropriate or not. Then it is not systematic. It opens us up to all sorts of problems for people who have much greater degrees of suffering than they should. Decisions about terminal sedation, when it is employed and the speed at which drugs are administered, are entirely in the hands of the treating doctor. If the doctor or institution holds the core belief that assisting someone to die is killing them, then the dying patient must face a death at the speed they determine, regardless of how clear and persistent that patient's request for a quick death may be. And by the way, Palliative Care Australia acknowledges that there are patients who make rational and persistent requests for help to die. Just as if the doctor or institution holds the core belief that there is a value in suffering, then as Alex Broom observed, the patient whose suffering cannot be relieved has little choice but to keep suffering. This is not to suggest that doctors won't help you. Of course they will, but at their speed, a speed which can be entirely determined by their personal beliefs, a speed over which by law, you as the patient and your family have no control. Now, the doctors hold strong personal beliefs is not an issue. They are absolutely entitled to them. That's what your Charter of Human Rights means when it says the right to freedom of thought, conscience, religion and belief. What is at issue is a law which currently enables them to impose those beliefs on vulnerable patients who may not share them. A law which gives them all the power and the dying patient none. Now, for the majority of us, thankfully, this will never be an issue. Palliative care in Australia, amongst the best in the world, is by and large very good at managing the end stage of life. It's why they're such a valuable service. In most cases, terminal sedation is considered best practice. But the fact that the majority die well is not the point of an assisted dying law. This law is not about the majority, but about the minority who do not obtain adequate or requested relief from palliative care. What's more, we have a good idea from Palliative Care's own statistics collected every year from 106 units around Australia what that minority looks like. According to the most recent available figures, of patients in the terminal phase of their illness, 4% had severe pain, 3% had severe psychological distress, and 7.5% had other severe physical symptoms. That's why Palliative Care Australia themselves admit that, quote, they cannot treat all pain and suffering even with optimal care. Does this mean palliative care are failing? No. The same problems are faced all over the world. They reflect a population that lives longer and dies largely of chronic illnesses, over which we still have little or no control. The argument that giving more resources to palliative care means we don't need assisted dying is a powerful one for politicians. In South Australia last year, where assisted dying was lost by 1 vote, the MP who crossed the floor at the last minute to vote against it gave that as his reason. But by their own admission, all the resources in the world aren't going to help palliative care deal with all pain and suffering. It is not medically possible. And until we find a cure for cancer, motor neuron disease and other horrors, this is unlikely to change. Neither will all the resources in the world help bring a quick end to a patient's suffering if doing so goes against the beliefs of the doctor or the institution that's treating them. Distressing evidence of this is provided in the case of Victorian man Rudy Dobrin, whose suffering had reached such a crescendo he determined that he wanted to die. With no quick means to end his life, Rudy invoked his legal right to end it as quickly as he could by refusing food and fluids. And he described his decision this way: "I'm dying of cancer of the throat. I can no longer control my bowels, nor eat or drink. If I was a pet, I would have had a peaceful injection days ago. But I'm human, and so I'll have to go through the barbaric religious ritual of dying without dignity from dehydration over weeks." Seeking support in this difficult choice, he entered a faith-based Melbourne palliative care facility, having been assured that he could expect to die with minimal suffering. Rudy's medical records, obtained through freedom of information, are detailed in Rodney Symes' book, A Time to Die. They show that despite exhibiting ongoing symptoms of physical, psychological and existential suffering, Rudy did not receive 24-hour sedation until 32 days after he entered hospital. He eventually died a further 15 days later, 7 weeks after entering palliative care. All this, as Rodney Symes says, taking place not in a desert, but in Kew, with all amenities at hand. What is it your Human Rights Charter says? The right to protection from torture and cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment? This is why we need a law, so that we all have a legal right to be protected from unnecessary suffering at the end of life, so doctors have a legal right to help us, and so there can be more compassionate choices if we're dying and beyond medical help than starving ourselves to death, taking our own lives violently and alone, or being drugged into a coma. The likely shape of the legislation that will go before Parliament is being unveiled as I speak by the former head of the AMA, Professor Brian Owler. Professor Owler has chaired a panel containing some of Australia's most eminent end-of-life physicians, whose job it's been to advise the government on the operation of this law. And while we won't know all the details till later today, we do know that the law will be modelled closely on the committee's published recommendations. It will be a very conservative law, which in summary is likely to work like this. Only a mentally competent adult, 18 years and over, who is at the end of life, meaning last weeks or months, and who has a serious and incurable physical condition which is causing suffering that cannot be relieved in a manner the patient deems tolerable, is eligible. If you are suffering solely from mental illness, or are not mentally competent, or not a resident of Victoria, you will not qualify. You must make a verbal request, then a written request, then after a cooling off period, a further verbal request. To be legally assisted to die, you have to convince 2 doctors in assessments independent of each other that your illness is serious and incurable and in its final stages and your suffering intolerable. If either have concerns that your mental health is driving your request, they can decline the request or refer you to a psychiatrist. If your request is deemed eligible, they will write you a prescription for a drink which, if you decide to take it, will end your life quickly and peacefully at a time and in a place of your choosing. That's the law as the committee has proposed it in a nutshell. And perhaps the best way I can explain how it will help people is by playing you 2 pieces of audio. The first is from Sydney woman Shane Hickson, describing her mum Jan's last days in palliative care with a brain tumour.
She was seizuring for, I don't know how long it was, well over an hour, maybe a couple of hours. She said it was like a giant thrashing around in her body. So the brain, as you know, like it creates all sensations. So things were happening in her. She kept shaking and of course in the back of my mind that was what she feared the most, was having another seizure. She said, whatever you do not let me have another seizure. And so I knew that through the whole 6 months that was what she feared the most because of how dreadful it felt to her. And she kept shaking. It took, when she didn't stop shaking, we said, can you give her more? It's not working. He said, I can only give her this amount and every 15 minutes. I'm not authorised to give her any more. If I give her more, it might end it.
So how many nights did this go on again?
5 days. She went in on Thursday and she died on Tuesday morning.
So 5 days of largely unrelieved pain and distress for her, of course, also for you. And at no point was anyone prepared to go, we can do more.
No, not a nurse or doctor or anything.
the strong sense I get as I'm listening to you is that you must have all felt, and above all your mum, completely powerless and helpless in this situation.
Yes, completely powerless and angry, really upset that that's such a terrible time that you are sort of battling this, just shouldn't have to be like that. At one point, my older sister, she said to the GP, what are we meant to do? Go down on down to King's Cross on the street and try and score heroin or something? Like what choice? What are you saying? Like what choice do we have? And we just couldn't believe what was happening at that end stage.
The second piece of audio is from the Netherlands. The Hoffman sisters, Suzanne and Marianne, describing the death of their mother, Gret, also dying of cancer.
So we arranged it will happen this Friday at 5 o'clock. And why 5 o'clock? Because this family loves to have a drink with each other. And we started always at 5 o'clock. And then we eat together. So 5 o'clock we thought it was a nice moment.
Yeah. When 5 o'clock came, it came gently.
Yeah. And she said, okay, take a drink, we're gonna drink.
Yeah.
I don't take alcohol, but please you do.
Yeah, we cheered about her. And well, that's the most beautiful of this whole process.
Yeah.
That it would end for her.
Because she wants also to be quick, that it's done quickly. Beautiful but quickly.
Yeah.
Please don't make a fuss of it.
Yeah. And it's so strange, but the strength we've all felt was almost touchable.
It went so peaceful, so in harmony, so beautiful, nearly.
A peaceful goodbye.
Yeah. So the moment that my mother was there, and I didn't notice at all, and then suddenly she said, "Oh yeah,
I can
feel it," and then
that was
it.
Because she felt sleeping
in sleep, like that, because he really did his work against my
first injection.
And it's so beautiful. She was really glad when she said it. Oh yeah, I feel it.
I feel it. Yeah. It only lasted 5 minutes, but when I think back about it, it feels like a whole life, because it was we had this humor and these jokes and this pure love feeling in the house. Pure love there was. Yeah. And I know for sure, and I can say with a hand on my heart, this is exactly how Mother wants.
Oh yeah.
I'm sure, I don't know if you believe in life after death, of life after life. I do. And she is sitting on this cloud, looking satisfied and very proud.
Not only were these two deaths starkly different, as are the memories that their families carry of them, but so were the last months leading up to them. For Shane's mum Jan, an independent and vivacious woman, her last 6 months were filled with indignity. In Shane's words, her quality of life had deteriorated to a point where she couldn't read, couldn't write, she could hardly speak, she was bedridden, she'd lost all feeling down one side, and she would try to describe what it felt like. She felt that her body was already half dead. Jan's last 6 months were also filled with the all-consuming fear of more of those terrible seizures. Under our law, Jan had no choice but to face this indignity and fear as best she could, helped by medical teams doing the best they could. Despite her clearly expressed wish for help to die, there was no one she could turn to for that help or reassurance, just as there was little a doctor could do to offer such help, even if they wanted to. All she was told was that she would not suffer at the end, which of course turned out not to be true. For Jan, as well as her family, every day was filled with dread, and for her daughters, a rising sense of horror and guilt that they could do nothing to help their mum. Gret Hoffman, Susan and Marianne's mum, had a very different last few months. Even though Gret had been diagnosed with breast cancer many years before she died, she remained an active, outdoorsy woman. But when the cancer reappeared in her stomach, her bladder, her bones, and she could no longer be the person she wanted to be or live the life she loved, she began to consider how she wanted her remaining days to play out. On the day the hospital told her there was nothing more they could do to stem her cancer, she discussed with the family that she didn't want to go on as she was. With their blessing, she spoke to her family GP, who then spoke with the entire family, and they all agreed that Gret should seek assistance so she would not be forced to suffer beyond what she found bearable. After going through the rigorous assessment process, again by 2 doctors, independent of each other, Gret was judged legally eligible for such assistance. Her daughters noticed the change in her immediately. In Marianne's words, the peacefulness went over her. In her last days, even as the cancer ground her away, Gret would sometimes talk and joke. Other times she would sit quietly and look out the window in deep contemplation. Her daughters knew that she was saying goodbye to them and to the world. Clearly, the law helped Gret and her doctors, and her daughters, but it helped the family GP too by offering him legal protection to practice medicine compassionately